Let me begin by thanking Mario and his team. A Ray of Hope is a magnificent ministry, and the dedication to this ministry is remarkable. I want to congratulate each of you for spending your Saturday here seeking to find ways to bolster your approach, particularly to family life, but growing in your faith and growing in your friendships with each other. I've got a very different presentation than the one that you just heard from Dr. Ray. I don't know if people always feel the way I feel right now when they follow Dr. Ray. I'm not funny. So if you're looking for that, I apologize. I'll do my best. The talk that I prepared focuses on the next level of education. I want to talk about particularly higher education and Catholic higher education. And I'm going to give you 4 takeaways right from the start. These will anchor my remarks. The first, complete the race. Complete the race. The second, drawing upon the words of St. John Paul II, be not afraid, right? Not just the words of John Paul II, but the angel Gabriel coming to the Blessed Mother. Be not afraid. And part of what I want to address in my remarks centers on a kind of fear or anxiety that I've been detecting in particularly young Catholic parents when they're thinking about higher education in general. The third takeaway, the best defense is a good offense. Okay? And that second and third are intimately related. I think we are often, and rightly so, driven by a fear of the out there, the world out there. Okay? And we can get really defensive. And that can cause us to step back from cultivating the kind of virtues that will make us evangelists in a world that sorely needs us. And the fourth is, I want to remind each of you that Catholics are culture builders. Okay? And some of what I'm going to talk about is focusing on the way in which education is a matter of culture formation, living out the Great Commission, evangelizing the world, for Catholics has always centered in important ways on the university. You've probably heard of this apostolic constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, right? What the Latin means is from the heart of the church. And that constitution by John Paul II is focused on the purpose of the university. Not the Catholic university, the university, because universities are inventions of the Catholic Church, right? They come right out of the heart of the church and are fundamental to the work of culture formation. Okay, so those are the 4 takeaways. Complete the race that you're engaged in as parents now. Be not afraid. The best defense is a good offense. And then to be a Catholic is to be a culture builder. I'm going to start with an image that is fundamental to the Catholic intellectual tradition. One of the reasons that it's fundamental to the Catholic intellectual tradition is it's an image that comes from pagan Greece. Okay? This is something you probably already know, but you may not, that the Catholic intellectual tradition is not just about Catholic authors, right? Or Jewish and Catholic authors. The Western intellectual tradition is a unification of Jerusalem, Rome, and Athens in important ways. So the image comes from this pagan philosopher whose name is Plato. The work that I'm going to cite is The Republic. It's one of Plato's many works focusing on virtue, focusing on questions of best governance. And Plato is often regarded by the church fathers as a proto-Christian. Okay? He's helping to lay the foundations for the message of the gospel. His own hero is the philosopher Socrates. Okay? Socrates, St. Justin Martyr, calls the first witness to the faith, the first martyr, because he died witnessing to the Logos. Okay? But these are pagans, okay? Make no mistake. So the image comes from the heart of the Republic. The Republic is an extended argument focusing on the best possible political structure. The question is raised, how ought a state to be arranged so that the citizens can live flourishing lives? The questions of justice come up from that, but the heart of the matter, and this is what's relevant to my remarks, is a theory of education. And Plato, like St. John Paul II, recognized that there is this deep connection between the order of the state, the extent to which the political communities, society at large, is arranged and ordered to the human goods, and the kind of education that you have within that organization, that political body. So the image is the image of the cave. And Socrates, who's the main character in this dialogue, talks about these prisoners in the bottom of a cave. And they're chained in such a way that they cannot turn around to see what's behind them. They're staring at a wall, and there's light behind them. They don't know what that source of light is, but the light is casting shadows on the wall because in this strange image, you've got these objects that are being walked in front of the light. And what the prisoners are doing is debating what those shadows are, what those images are. They think that they're the real things. They think they're talking about reality. But in fact, they are prisoners, unable to see what's behind them. And then Socrates says, imagine one of these prisoners being freed. And that liberation is not something that the freed prisoner initially is excited about. Right? He turns around, he is terrified. He doesn't want to make his way out of that imprisonment. And so the liberator has to drag him bit by bit. And he does so, then he sees, okay, well, there's a fire, and it's casting the light in such a way to project those images on the wall. And all those other people, my fellow prisoners, they don't know what they're looking at. And then he's led further up and out of the cave, and he sees that there's light at the end. And then he realizes, okay, there's a sun. There's an outside. There are actual trees and birds and vases and all the other objects of the world. He's amazed. He wants to spend the rest of his life there in the real world. But then he eventually feels a call to go back and try to free his fellow prisoners. Now, what happens when he goes back and says, you guys think you're looking at real objects, but you're actually just looking at shadows, that's not appreciated. And eventually, the fellow prisoners decide to banish him, and if he won't leave, they decide to kill him. That's what happened to Socrates himself. So this is a theory of education. How so? Well, a couple of points here, right? And this image is really at the heart of the way in which the Catholic intellectual tradition thinks about what it is to be well educated. Okay? You have to see things themselves. The world is not always or only all that there is. Okay? The objects that we encounter are glimpses of deeper realities. There's more to see, there's more to know. Second point, we need to be led. Those prisoners don't want to make their way out of the cave. It takes great teachers who've already glimpsed the realities to be engaged in that work. Best case scenario, it takes teachers who've not just seen, but are motivated by faith in the deeper realities, right? So within a Catholic educational environment, you've got both faith and reason engaged in that work. I said that this is in some way fundamental to how we think about the role of the political order. Right? Those prisoners in the cave, those prisoners are us. Right? When we talk about liberal arts, that's a matter of liberation from the kind of enslavement that we have to false notions and to vice. So, Plato is describing this cave at a time in which the iPhone did not exist and many of the other distractions in our life. But when I think about young people today, young and old alike, but particularly thinking about younger people, they've had almost the whole of their existence mediated through screens, right? These shadows. And the love that they have for those shadow images, the entertainments, okay, that's strengthening the chains that bind them, that make them resistant to being led up out of the cave. So if anything, I think our task in this day and age is more challenging than it was in Plato's. What I have seen happen in a lot of families is parents do a wonderful job. We know many wonderful families, as Alicia was saying earlier. We've been blessed with friendship with the Hernans for, I don't know, maybe 27, 28 years. I used to teach at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and our houses were nearby. And we know many other wonderful families as well. I see a lot of families think, okay, I've done everything I can. My son, my daughter has graduated from high school, and now they're just going to get the education they need to get a job. Just do it as quickly as possible, have a very specialized major, and do it as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible. Our job's done. What happens at so many universities today is all of that good work that you have dedicated to the formation of your sons and daughters is laid away, right? They're thrust right back into the cave. And they've got fellow prisoners, happy prisoners. They're told this is the way to live, and they begin to listen to those whispering voices of the other people who are chained in the bottom of the cave. And I think there's more work to be done. So when I'm talking about complete the race, finish the race, you're not done at 18. You're not done at 22, one of the things that my wife, who's here, Rebecca, and I have discovered, you're not done when they're 28 either. You know, your children are still your children forever. They need your constant care. But I want to encourage you not to just throw them into the lion's den when you've sent them out from your house, okay? But I want to also encourage you to not be driven by fear or anxiety when you think about where you send them next. So, be not afraid. Let me give you a quick way to grade different university environments. I have a doctorate from a state university. I went to a Jesuit university for my undergraduate studies. I taught at another Jesuit university as well as at Franciscan. I speak at a lot of universities. I've seen different environments. And, you know, you've got publics, you've got Ivies, you've got, say, kind of Catholic, and you've got more serious about their faith, Catholic schools, and there are some significant differences, right? So what you can expect at a big public school, if your son or daughter is just going into that school, is they're not going to get a lot of personal attention. They're going to have a lot of professors who are driven by a variety of ideas that are probably contrary to the ones with which you raised them. They may be okay, but they really need to find a network of strong Catholic friends. It is not guaranteed that they're going to lose their faith there, and in some respects, it could be a better environment than a Catholic university that has really abandoned its commitment to fidelity. When I went to my undergraduate college, I was profoundly scandalized by a number of things. I'll just focus on maybe three briefly. I was in a scripture class, and my professor, who was a nun, was insistent that Mary could not have been a perpetual virgin. This is just a crazy idea, and I was the only guy in the class to say, wait a second, this is pretty core to the faith. And she joked about my sort of devotional attitude. It was a laughing matter in the classroom. I was a big boy, I could take it. So it's not like I wilted under that, but it was funny, right? She tried to make it funny that I was insisting upon Mary's perpetual virginity. Second, I was looking around at the back of the campus ministry office outside from the chapel, and what was the most prominent material that was displayed? Catholics for Free Choice, right? And this was an organization that was dedicated to the pro-abortion cause. And I raised this as objectionable, and I was told that I was out of line and that I needed to loosen up. And that was connected to the third thing, where my wife and I both, we weren't married when we started doing this, although we were married by the end, when we were involved in the Students for Life Club at the university. There was an effort taken by a priest and a group of students who were on scholarship because of their service orientation. And that effort was to defund the Students for Life Club because we were not fit for this Catholic university, right? We had to go and defend ourselves in front of student government and narrowly won a vote to maintain our status as a legitimate organization within this Catholic university. And because we were too political, well, we did pray rosaries in front of abortion clinics. Most of our time was spent working at a crisis pregnancy center and helping them out. So, those were scandalous examples, and there are many, many more. And I reached a point where I thought, okay, if this is what Catholicism actually is, because my early experience was mainly within a charismatic community that was ecumenical. My parents were always Catholic. We would go to Mass once a week. We didn't have a whole lot of Catholic devotionals. And I thought, well, maybe I'm like an evangelical. I believe in the reality of Jesus, but this is not what I thought Catholicism was, but maybe that's what it is. I decided that I had enough faith to stay close to the sacraments, and fortunately, John Paul II had just issued a new catechism, 1992, I think was the date of that. So I started to work through that, and step by step, deepened my faith. And as I was making my way through this undergraduate college, I would occasionally still go to the student mass, and the numbers were dwindling. So many of my classmates came from great families, and all of these little efforts, it wasn't just, those examples I gave were not just happening to me, they were happening to everyone, all kinds of signals being given. And people were abandoning the faith in droves. Okay, I'm not using this term scandal imprecisely. That's exactly what scandal does. It drives people away from the faith. So when I said, you could be in a better situation maybe in a public school, public university, than a Catholic university that doesn't take its faith seriously. That's part of what I mean by that. So those are two gradations. Now I do know there are vibrant Newman centers at some publics, also at some Ivies, and I know people who have really been formed well, but you're formed well on, let's say, Saturday and Sunday, and then the rest of the week you are thrown back into the pit, and you don't have an integrated approach to the whole, okay? So I do think, following John Paul II, that the best environment is one in which you've got an integrated approach to a genuine liberal arts education, one that is orienting the students to lives of professional success. There are some safe Catholic universities that don't have an emphasis on preparation for lives of professional success. I think it's important to include that, but it's also important to expose your sons, your daughters, to the fullness of the intellectual tradition that is the vehicle for the way in which Catholicism is a matter of culture formation. At the heart of what happened with a number of Catholic universities, and it is my hope and prayer that we've got a great reformation in those Catholic universities like mine that stepped away from their fidelity to the magisterium. But at the heart of what happened there is an anxiety that if we take the faith really seriously, we won't be great. We won't be academically excellent. And it's a little mind-boggling when you have spent time looking at the tradition, because it's from Catholicism that the greatest scientists, mathematicians, artists, politicians, attorneys have come, right? It's the university, as John Henry Newman calls it, the idea of the university that animates true greatness in culture. That's part of our inheritance. But I think as American Catholics, so much of our experience has been as second-class citizens, right? Our country is, or at least was, by and large, a Protestant country. We've always been a little bit on the margins or in the inner cities. And part of what happened with American Catholic universities in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is they felt that kind of anxiety about their Catholicism, and they wanted to tamp it down and pretend like it wasn't that important, and then it really became not that important, okay? So, as parents, I would just encourage you to really discern when your sons and daughters are looking at colleges. Make sure, if it's not going to be a place like the University of Dallas, make sure that they've found a pathway there, a group of friends, people you can trust, okay? Don't just throw them in. And I think we need to let go of the idea that college is a time for a young person to figure out exactly what they're going to do for the rest of their life from the first moment, right? So there's a lot of anxiety that I notice in 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Okay, where are you going to college? What are you going to major in? Well, they feel compelled to answer that question. Okay, what am I going to major in? And what you're going to major in often means what will you do professionally for the rest of your life? Well, it's a strange person who actually knows that. And yet we all spend so much psychological effort, or put psychological pressure on these young people to know exactly what they're going to do the rest of their life. And then we have a kind of utilitarian approach to higher education. You know, you spent some time when you were younger reading good books, getting a little exposure. Now it's time to get serious, get your job. A lot of people are waking up at age 29, 31, thinking, what on earth am I doing with my life, right? They were taken out of the oven before fully cooked, so to speak, and forced to make choices they weren't quite ready for. Yeah. There's a deeper level. This is what the liberal arts are dedicated to, a deeper level of exploration where you encounter how human beings have made sense of the world and themselves and God through different disciplines. And they see how it all fits together. And then by the time they're engaged in their majors, they're reflecting upon what St. John Henry Cardinal Newman calls the unity of knowledge. Okay? And that is absolutely essential, not just for the sake of them knowing what they're going to do professionally, but you want to spend your lifetime growing into the education that you received in your collegiate years. I think it's really important. And I really do think we put a lot of anxiety into our young people because we're worried about money, we're worried about time. They feel that anxiety and they're not quite ready to make some of those decisions. So having some time to broaden their perspectives, to reflect upon big questions from a more mature point of view, to think about God, to think about the nature of reality from vantage points that they hadn't explored before. That's really, really valuable. And we feel some fear about putting them into that environment. Maybe they'll get stuck there forever, and philosophy majors are just flipping burgers the rest of their lives, right? Or you're an English major? Really? You just threw your life away. Comments like that are common. I was an English major for a while and then switched to philosophy and classical languages What am I going to do with dead languages? Why would I spend 4 years of my college life reading literature in Greek and Latin? Well, the saints, the fathers, the doctors of the church would say because it's intrinsically good to do that and to explore authors who are challenging you in fundamental ways. What we do in that process is we learn to become independent thinkers. We learn to think for ourselves. And in learning to think for ourselves, we develop the tools we need to navigate a world that often is challenging, right? St. Peter tells us in his letter that we ought always to endeavor to find a reason for our faith. St. Augustine says, credo ut intellegiam, right? I believe so that I might understand. There's a process of working to the point of understanding. St. Anselm says that the intellectual effort is a matter of, he says, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. So you begin with the faith, but there's a quest. We're looking to understand. Okay? Catholicism is not fundamentalism. Catholicism is not fideistic. The church teaches what is true. What's true is not true because the church teaches it. Rather, the church teaches what is true. Okay? And what I mean by fideistic is falling into this idea that, whatever the church says, that makes it true. And whatever the reasons might be, I don't need to know, I just need to believe. Well, God gave us minds, and He wants us to use them. And by learning to use them in the best battlefield of preparation for the rest of your life, right, then you can go on the offensive. You can build. You can be confident when you go out into the world because you've learned to think for yourselves. You've acquired the tradition that really is at the core of Western civilization. You have become a citizen of that tradition. You've achieved your humanity in significant ways through this education. And that, I want to just encourage you to recognize, is so valuable to impart to your children. But in order to impart it, you have to let go. You have to let them explore. You have to let them be adventurous. You want to do it in a way that allows you to have some trust, right? So it does matter what people study. It matters who they study with. It matters who their friends are. I often describe a genuine liberal education. I'm using liberal again in the sense of liberating, right, from ignorance, from your disordered passions, liberated for a life that's well lived. I describe that kind of education as friendship for the sake of friendship, because you want to allow people to cultivate a kind of friendship with the truth. And in order to do that, it matters to be in an environment where you've got professors who think there is truth to be found, okay? But it also matters to have professors who have a real care for those students, who want to lead them up out of the cave, who think that there is a destination on the other side where you'll see things more clearly. You want to have the opportunity to wrestle with the deepest questions of human existence with others who are wrestling with those same questions. C.S. Lewis tells us that friendship is not like romantic love, where you gaze into the eyes of the other and it's all about you and her or you and him. Friendship is a matter of walking shoulder to shoulder, gazing upon a common object that you share a passion for, right? So having friends who care whether or not Aristotle's treatment of being is better than Plato's matters, right? Is Hector the greater hero, or is it Achilles in Homer's Iliad, right? Now, we might say, well, who cares? What does that have to do with reality? Well, in reading a great epic novel, for instance, you encounter what it is to be a hero, and you learn to argue about what's genuinely heroic. You learn to argue about whether or not you need to combine virtues of character with those virtues of effective leadership. Can they really be divorced? So, when I gave as one of the outcomes this notion of, the best defense is a good offense, this is what I'm pointing towards. Okay? In order for your sons, your daughters, your grandsons, your granddaughters to effectively navigate the world in a way in which they won't be swallowed by it, in a way in which they won't just be thrust back into that cave and told that those shadows on the wall are the real realities, and what it is to be successful in life is to be an elite leader because you're the best at determining which shadow you're looking at, or you're the best at spinning the narrative about what those shadows are, right? In order to avoid that and to be able to spot baloney when others are uttering it, and in order to raise good families themselves, right? They need to be able to exercise these virtues of arguing without quarreling, of identifying whether or not this economic set of claims is true or false because they've studied some economics, whether or not this historical claim is true or false. Can they follow an argument? Do they know the difference between a premise and a conclusion? Can they distinguish between validity and invalidity? That matters. It matters not just in a logic classroom or in a philosophy class. It matters when you pick up the newspaper or you have a coworker tell you something or a friend, right? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the tools of effective argumentation, being able to go on the offensive. There are no shortcuts to that, no special pills you can swallow to make you achieve that. It takes time, and I don't think there's any kind of preparation like what you find in a genuine liberal arts education. Speaking of, looking at the time, I've got 58 seconds. Can I take a couple more? Yes. All right. I won't take too many more, but let me finish by talking a little bit about this notion of Catholicism is a matter of culture formation. I do think, because the world has become so corrupt, because even some of our fellow Catholics have adopted mindsets that are already on the other side, so to speak, of the way in which we have dedicated our lives to cultivating virtue in our kids. We can feel very much like it's an us-they situation. And we want to circle the wagons. We want to protect. And I think there's some value in that, of course. I mean, within your own home, you've got to protect your kids. You've got to protect your wife if you're a husband. you need to make sure that you've got the right environment where you don't have to be constantly immersed in the cacophony of this present world. That's good. It's good to have a university that enables a kind of retreat from the busyness of everyday life. But when I think about the students at the University of Dallas, I don't think that it serves them well to make them feel like, okay, you've got this great education, now go do some job, but don't stand out too much, protect your family. No, I want our graduates to be the top surgeons in the medical system, and some of them are. I want them running multi-billion-dollar corporations, and some of them are. We complain about corrupt, woke companies, and we should. They're deeply corrupt. Okay, winning means running those corporations, having graduates of great Catholic education who are so effective that they take them over. Right? We are the innovators. We are the artists. We are the educators. This is our inheritance as Catholics. And we need to not be afraid. We need to claim our inheritance and take it to our culture, not as an act of war, but of restoration, of rebuilding. And I think we are in a time of rebuilding. And when you think about your sons and daughters, your grandsons, your granddaughters, hold before them the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, verse 14, right? You know the story. One servant gets 5 talents, another gets 3, another gets 1. The master goes away. The guy with 5 turns it into 10. The guy with 3 into 6. The guy with 1 buries his talent. And the master returns and says to the fellow who turned his 5 into 10, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Receive your reward." And to the one who turned his 3 into 6, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Right? What happens to the guy who was terrified? Right? "I knew you, master, were a forbidding and demanding master. I was afraid, and so I hid this talent. It's preserved. I've got it right here." Well, what happens to that guy? He gets thrown out where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, cast out from the presence of the Lord. We need to be not afraid. We need to inspire our young people to acts of great goodness. We need to cultivate in them the virtue of magnanimity, of aspiring for greatness. This is not a threat to humility. St. Thomas Aquinas argues that those are complementary virtues. You cannot utilize the talents that God has given you in an act of humility by burying it. That's not being humble. Right? Genuine humility recognizes that God is the source of all the gifts and talents we have, all the resources that we have. And by golly, you ought to plow those gifts, those resources into doing great things for the glory of God and building up his kingdom. That is our charge as parents. And what I have sought to put before you this morning is that charge is directly related to the role of the Catholic University in helping young people achieve their call to living magnanimous, humble, and holy lives. Thanks so much.